and all those things that we talk about in this board meeting all the time about governance and so on. I'm getting new insight into that from a sort of the ED perspective, as you guys I think would sort of call it. But oh, it's great. I mean, it's absolutely great. There's just a lot of it.
It has been so fun to watch you on Twitter and on LinkedIn and to see all you're doing, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, congrats. It's awesome.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for your support, because I couldn't have done it without you.
No.
I'll go next.
I was gonna say
I'm on the opposite side of my name's Angie Eikenberry. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, and at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but also the president of ARNOVA, or the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. And we have been searching for an executive director, which we'll hopefully have an announcement about that coming soon. But so I can appreciate Carl, yeah, very much from the board side. You know, that it's a huge endeavor and such important work, and I have also been able to draw on what we do here to inform that search, and it's been, I think, a good one because of it.
Exciting stuff. Who else?
Well, I will go. It's Justin Pollock in Washington, D.C., and I'm spending my time just thinking about and trying to disrupt everything that Angie and Carl are doing. So I really like being in this space too. So, but the thing that is consuming my life right now is I am 5 days away from my eldest daughter's bat mitzvah. So the fact that I have 2 hours right now that is not being spent practicing my own Hebrew is pretty good.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yay.
I'm Jane Garson. I'm the Canadian on this call. And instead of congratulating Carl, I want to congratulate Carl's board for being smart enough to choose him. And what's exciting in my life is since in October, I ended my interim CEO work. They'd hired an amazing young Métis filmmaker to take over from me. It's just wonderful, and I'm getting my life back and even starting to find parts of my office that had been buried in to-do piles the whole time I was an interim CEO.
Wow. Awesome.
Well, I'm Ann Vermel, and I'm new to this group, although some of you are familiar faces, and it's nice to see you again. I feel a little out of my depth because I stopped working in nonprofits, except that I definitely work in the arts, which are always nonprofits. So, so although I thought I had retired to be a nicely quiet retired lady, I ended up back in the theater world and the symphony world and the chamber music world. And then what's really going on in my life is that November is National Write a Novel Month, and I've joined it.
Oh, you're doing NaNoWriMo, how wonderful.
I am. I'm going nuts. I'm very excited.
To those who don't know, she just gave up a month of her life, and it's amazing she's on this screen.
Awesome, awesome, awesome.
Must be that your writing fingers are tired.
They are, see, they look it right. But what's really tired is the brain.
No kidding, no kidding.
Oh, then you'll fit right in here.
Mr. Petropoulos.
Hello, I'm in Tucson, Arizona. Yay! And it's another beautiful day here. I mention that because part of my awesome is that I've decided I'm going to do the Tour de Tucson this year, which is at the end of this month. And it is a perimeter cycling event. And I have been kind of training for that. I'm not going to do the full one because I'm not that crazy, but I am going to look at a 50-mile loop, which is just wonderful. And this last weekend, I did my first climbing training and survived. So I see that something to be excited about. And my second awesome is to be in this meeting, to see all these faces. So I'm just excited to be here and to see everyone.
Yay. And I am Hilda Gottlieb with Creating the Future. I am here in Tucson, Arizona as well. And there is just so much that's awesome. We will, in our December meeting, we will have a new board member that we're bringing on. And so that is exciting. Related to Creating the Future, Dimitri and I got back about 3 weeks ago from a month all across California. Our second community engagement tour for Creating the Future, doing speaking and convening and guest lecturing and running away from fires. And California was a bit of a scary mess, but really remarkable response. It is very worth noting to many of you have been involved on and off with even the precursor to Creating the Future and all of the thinking that's gone on into this. And when we first started talking in this way, we used to get a lot of people looking at us like we were crazy and saying, yeah, that's cute and visionary, but come on. And the world is ready for this. Last year we noted it, this year we noted it. Audiences are like on fire. And so that was pretty exciting. And personally, our local art cinema is having its 10th annual film festival. When their executive director went to the Toronto Film Festival, Carl is saying that we're breaking up. Is anybody else's stream breaking up? Or is, okay, right, because I just want to make sure it's nothing we need to do on our end. It's usually Wi-Fi or usually whatever. The Loft Film Festival is celebrating its 10th year. And when the executive director was at the Toronto Film Festival, they announced that by either 2021 or 2022, there was going to be a 50-50 split, male versus female directors for the Toronto Film Festival. And Peggy came back and said, why do we need to wait until 21 or 22? Let's do it now. And so this year is the first year that the Loft Film Festival is 50% female directors, 50% male. And so that's exciting. We have got 3 movies slated for the next 2 days that Dimitri and I are going to. And in preparation for the new Scorsese film, The Irishman, I had never seen the Godfather movies.
Oh.
And so as a cinephile, that was, I couldn't live with that anymore. And so we watched The Godfather 1 and 2 this weekend.
Whoa.
So those are all very, very awesome. And yeah, we get to see lots of movies this week, which will be marvelous. Marvelous. And I too am, a huge awesome is the response I've been getting from folks to what we came to at our last meeting, what the work that we have been doing and where we settled at our last meeting. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, we got back from our trip a little too late to get a lot of people who could be here today. We have several people who have said, I love this. I'm so excited by this, and are hoping to be at the December meeting. So that's exciting. Anyone who is watching this, if you have any thoughts, tweet right now to the hashtag Creating the Future. And if you would like to be with us during our next meeting, please let us know, because this, the fun part about our group is you can never tell who's actually on the board and who's not, and it really doesn't matter because we're all chipping in together, which is pretty awesome. So that said, let's dive into this good stuff, which I'm so excited about, just so excited about. Those of you who, I'll sort of do a quick overview of where we've come, where we are. It has been about 4 years that this conversation started with a question about organizational design. Is the standard organizational design actually designed to accomplish social missions, and especially accomplish a global social mission? The answer became very, very quickly no, and we spent a couple of years trying to figure out, okay, what kind of design would look like. We followed the catalytic thinking framework, asking first and foremost, who will be affected by this change? What does this change potentially make possible for them? What does organizational structure make possible, period? What could it make possible? And over that couple of years, we defined sort of a networked platform where the important piece being that decisions are made by the people who are actually impacted by the decision. That's the people doing the work. That is also the people who are in the world. We talked a lot about sharing power, and decisions being made by people who are affected seems like the way that we would like to see things working, which led, of course, to the question of, all right, so where does the board fit into all of that? And we spent another long period of time. Justin and I spent on and off about a year talking with compliance people, talking with attorneys, and asking the question, so what exactly are boards legally required to do? And the answer, well, I think we actually came up with two answers, neither of which are the ones that anybody. One, they are required to exist. So in a corporation, we must have a board. Some states require there's one board member, some require that there's three. But the one thing that you're required is boards must exist. The second thing that is positively required is that you don't negatively impact the organization. So the only thing really in statutes is what not to do. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this if you're on the board. But there is nowhere that says that this is what boards must do. And from what we've been able to gather, it is pretty similar in Canada. I don't know what the situation is in the UK, Carl. But it was really interesting as we started asking the questions specific to our board and the work Creating the Future is doing. You know, what are we legally required to do as a board? And as Justin noted before, the answer really is there's nothing positively that we're required to do, which opened the doors to our going through the framework again and saying, okay, then what does a board make possible? Especially, we had sort of settled on looking at what our friends at Inspiral in New Zealand had called a minimum viable board focused on compliance, which is how they are looking at their board. As we started to unpack compliance, which just didn't feel like us, we started to talk more and more about expectations. Who has expectations of us? And the list was long. I'll bring it up on my screen in a little bit. But compliance, you know, lets you think that it's law, it's state law and federal law and any legal compliance. Expectations is pretty much everybody. And so again, going through the catalytic thinking framework, we asked, all right, what do those expectations, if we meet those expectations, what does that make possible for our mission and for those folks who have expectations? And what we came up with last meeting, which I'm still jazzed about, and I'm gonna read. We really talked about the board as the keeper of the organization's integrity. That if we have a board whose job is to ask people who have expectations of us, what are your expectations? What would you want to see that shows that we're meeting those expectations? And then the board would figure out ways to evidence that, to answer that. They would get those questions answered. They would go back to folks and say, here's what we found. Is that what you're interested in? And if not, or if so, asking again, and just really creating a cycle of asking, figuring out what does it take for the board to ensure we have the answers. And the aha, the beautiful aha, that really is about walking our talk, about what does it take to be walking our talk with integrity and making sure it's one of those things. There's so much conversation going on right now about boards and are they effective, and what could make them more effective. And one of the big issues is that because there is really no, this is what you must do, boards wind up doing a lot of duplicative stuff. They wind up repeating what staff is doing, or interfering with what staff is doing. And this was one role that we found that really no one is doing. There's lots of individual people doing and maybe answering to individuals, but there's nobody really within an organization, no group, and there's no group that makes more sense than the board to be charged with making sure that we're walking our talk with integrity. So, did I leave anything out? All of you who were there, not there, have read. Does that sound about right?
And a wonderful summary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. We are going to start building this. We're going to start building this. Let me bring up on the screen two things. First, I want to remind anybody who is watching what catalytic thinking looks like in action. A situation presents itself. We listen to what people are saying about that situation. In our case, it was initially organizational structure and then became the role of the board within that, being as we legally have to have a board. We asked a lot about whose lives would be impacted by any action we took when it came to the board meeting expectations. I will bring up the list in a second of what that list looked like, who has expectations of us. And then we will start asking, okay, what does this kind of board make possible? We've talked about that an awful lot. And we found that what it made possible, again, was democratizing, walking our talk. There was so much good stuff, and it's all linked within the blog posts. So if you are watching this and you're curious, all of that is linked within the blog posts of the amazing stuff that an integrity board could make possible. And that really is where we looked at the conditions for success, what needs to be in place. That was where we came up with the asking and the checking in and figuring out what the responses are. And we're right now at, okay, if this is the board we're going to build, which is our actions, really looking at what are our internal conditions for success. So what does the board need to have? What do they need to know? What do they need to value? What do board members need to be assured of? And so that's really where we're at right now. We're going to start, if we're going to build, we need to know what those conditions are that will make it successful. I do want to just take one moment and share the long list of folks who have expectations of us. And as we constructed what we came up with last time, and again, if you're watching this, you will find those in linked within the blog posts. But everything, you know, the IRS and state and federal law, that was a gimme, that was easy. We're really going down the list of who else has expectations of us. Board members have expectations, employees, contractors, vendors, journalists. Really, it is a list of anyone that might have an expectation of our organization in particular, but really any organization, which was beautiful in how it informed our conversation. And so we begin. Let's look at, before we take action, what does creating the future and the board need to have? What do they need to know in order to fill this role? What needs to be in place in order for us to have a board that fills this role.
So there's something that I've actually been thinking about a lot. I just read a recent piece on sort of conflicts of interest and things like that. But we talk about an integrity board. We talk about a fiduciary, and both of those have embedded in them the best interest of another. Like, or just actually, first they have the notion of the best interest, and actually, I sort of towed around with me the dictionary beneficiary of fiduciary, which is a person who has decision-making authority over the property of another for their benefit. Mm-hmm. So it's not about money, but it's all about sort of how you're engaging in decision-making for the benefit of something else or someone else, and then being aware of what it is that you actually have decision-making authority around. But as I was reading these pieces on conflict of interest, we keep talking about the best interest of the organization. And I had one of those moments, which was, to what degree do people really understand what the best interest of the organization is? Is there really clarity? And that's a values piece, because best is it's a values word. It's not absolute, but so the first piece of that, which I think is part of the answer to your question, Hildy, is how is the best interest of the organization defined and understood by the board members? So is there a strong definition? From a personal standpoint, it would be defined in terms of community, because that's where the current construct has failed, is that we don't often look through the lens of best interest of community. So that's certainly a step, which is to say the best interest of the organization equates to the best interest of the community. Mm-hmm. I'll just put that out there. That's the framework that I'm coming from. So it's gonna be the bias that I have. But the flip side of that is also, and this is one of those brain science things that I don't know the answer to, is, do people actually understand when they are acting in their own best interest or their own interest? Because we talk about conflicts of interest being when your own interests are in conflict with the organization's interest. If first we don't understand what the best interest of the organization is, that's a challenge. Mm-hmm. The other is if we can't actually recognize when we are being dominated by our own self-interest. We don't even know that the thing we're asking for, the thing that we're advocating for, is actually self-serving. That was sort of my epiphany. I was like, is that like a higher order of awareness, that we don't have a mechanism for people to actively reflect on when they are expressing their own self-interest? And it does go back to something that came up through Creating the Future, was redefining that as a confluence of interest. You're always going to be working in your own self-interest. It's just a question of how aware you are of whether that's selfishly pointing or community pointing. So those are just some framing, and probably there are pieces in there that are things that we would need to have and know as board members.
I'd like to build on that. I think I've probably read the same NPQ articles you just read to remind us of some of this situation. I get asked a lot about this, and I remind people that we are there for the best interest of the community. And if that conflicts with our organization, that's maybe it's time to talk wind up or stopping what we're doing. So it's worth remembering to talk about both when we talk about best interest. So generally they'll match. When they don't, that's a really big issue to stop and talk about. The other thing, to go back to answering Hildy's original question of what else do we need, if the board is as board members, and of course we wear more than one hat sometimes, is going to limit itself to certain limited roles, then what you need is people who will do all the rest of the stuff. Whether those are staff or volunteers or community members that don't recognize themselves under either of those terms. We need people to actually carry out the programs and services and keep the board informed so that they know whether we're living our values, or find some mechanism for the board to know whether or not the values are in play or being violated. I'm trying to avoid using terms like CEOs and whatever, because that's all
Yeah.
structural and it doesn't matter yet. And
Yeah.
maybe it never does.
Yeah, very, very much so, very much. The thought that's occurring to me as you're talking, Jane, is not just that there are people to do all the rest of the stuff, i.e., you know, the people who would normally be carrying out the mission. Two thoughts occurred to me. One is that most of all the rest of the stuff that boards normally do, for the most part, is being done by others anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Planning and, you know, we keep bringing boards in so that boards can pretend that they plan and lead, or understand what the organization is about. So that occurred to me as you were talking. But the other thing that occurred to me was, if this board is to have this serious role that is going to require so much engagement with the people who have expectations of us, that the board itself is going to need staff. The board itself is going to need support. And that's just become really, really clear to me. Go, Carl.
My apologies if this is not very articulate. But Justin, as he always does, I mean, it prompts all sorts of things in my head. And one of them is that we're very amid discussions in my organization and externally at the moment about notions of inclusion and diversity. And in turn, these are leading on to conversations about power and privilege. And this, one of the things that was said to me a bit ago is that when you use these terms like engagement, they almost sort of suggest like we are inviting people in to join our discussions, and therefore they almost shine a light on the fact that actually, the way that we're doing,
No, come back. Oh.
or that you have to join us. So I think what I'm trying to say is that when you ask what is it that a board needs and what the trustees need, well, what we need to be is we need to be of the people that are at the start of the diagram. And when we talk about what's the sort of the highest potential that we could achieve for those people, I guess there is a risk there that we could fall into the trap of doing to rather than doing with or doing amongst. So what we need as a board is to be amongst and with rather than to.
It's funny, Carl, you bring up engagement, and every time I hear that word, I think of this scene from The Princess Bride where Fezzik says, "I do not think that means what you think it means." And, you know, when I work with boards around that word, I'm like, there is a power element. And you know, I sort of say, if you're going to use that word, are you prepared for the implications? Which is, you know, because one of the things I love doing is asking people, describe what a time when you felt engaged. And there's always something about feeling honored and feeling like you have power. Like your contribution actually affected the change. And it's like, then you flip that and say, well, have you created board meetings or boards that actually feel like they truly can affect change? Or even more importantly, when you say you're engaging the community, have you actually created mechanisms where they have power to truly affect change within your organization and how it works? So I just love that sparked, and I think it's great that you're actually thinking about that question too, because it is so true that's the issue, I think, around a lot of the diversity and inclusion is including in what? Like, can I include you in the broken system that excluded you? Like,
well, that brings to mind for me, and I've been playing with the idea, what is a fiduciary, and what does the word fiduciary mean? And what are the power dynamics of a fiduciary? Who decides, you know, what's in the best interest of whoever? And I am working in the best interest of, or working to make sure that what I do is in the best interest of whomever. But that also has some defining issues. And who defines that? And what does it mean? And I know that in frequently in a board situation, I could have a conflict of interest, but that conflict of interest as defined by whom and expressed to whom. So if everybody knows X is going on, is it a conflict of interest? And as a board member, living my fiduciary responsibility to the interested parties, the rest of the board, the organization, the community, whatever, in the decisions that I'm making, and how much of their input or engagement is needed, so that definition of what a fiduciary isn't that just that legal in the best interest of, but fleshes that best interest of out. What is the best interest of?
Right. Right. Well, and the reminder that we are talking about a board that will make no decisions, that decisions will be made on the ground with people who are affected by whatever the decision is. And so defining that, I think, is going to be really important in terms of if the board finds something in their, ooh, we're not meeting the expectations here. What are the protocols for what the board does to make sure that the people who are most impacted by whatever that thing is are the ones that are actually making the decisions about it?
Which brings up issues about the decisions now in many of our nonprofits being made by intermediaries, like the frontline staff or whoever, not the people being served. And their idea of best interest is often diametrically opposed to what the people they're serving would think of as their best interest. In Canada, we're still trying to recover from the residential schools where they thought the best interest of Indigenous children was to be taken from their family and have the Indian beaten out of them. That was the explicit wording. So I am very leery of frontline staff coming back to me when I'm in a board or management role and saying, oh yes, we've consulted and this is, we're recommending this option because it's in the best interest. And I look and think, what do you actually mean by consulted? Did you listen to anybody? Did you just go out and talk at them, hear a few comments that you chose to ignore, and come back to the board with what you planned to do in the first place, which I think we've all seen happen many times.
I think it really comes down to when Carl was using the language before, are we doing things to people or with them?
Mhm.
Are we doing things even for people, which is so paternalistic, or with them? That big, huge piece of who gets to make the decisions, and how are those decisions made?
So,
Um,
sorry.
I'm kind of interested in the fact that I'm still hearing a separation between board and staff. First of all, my first comment is that on the list that you showed of people with expectations, the word community wasn't there. The whole community has expectations of a symphony orchestra or not. In other words, the community wants one or it doesn't. And part of the community may want one, so there will be one for those people. But when they stop wanting it, or when the general community stops wanting it, what happens? So that's one thing. The second thing is, what I'm hearing is that you've come up with in the last conversations is a board concept where the listening to the people with expectations is done by a group of people called the board. And they're obviously trained in the catalytic thinking framework. They are supported, and because they have to know who is the list of people that whose expectations need to be met. And then do they give that to the board and then what? I mean, to the staff and then what? Or does the staff say, we see 3 different options here. and come back to the board and say, let's work together to see which which fit most with what your findings were. What, I mean, you see what I'm going for?
It is again, really the dynamic of if the decisions are made on the ground, basically. If decisions about things are made on the ground at whatever level they make sense to, if it is the plan for the entire organization, it may make sense for everybody to be engaged in some way, to be involved in some way. If it is a local decision, then it makes sense for that decision to be made there. If those decisions are being made and the board is not making any decisions, the whole dynamic between the board and the not just the staff, the board and everyone who is not on the board. What is that relationship? What is that dynamic? What are the protocols for making sure that the board has what it needs to be able to say, oh, you asked about this and here's what we've come up with, and or to be listening, as we're noting, to be listening to what people want, and to then go back to whomever has that information to be able to say, do we have that information? What is it? How are we framing it? I mean, the technical aspects of really the how is, you know, how is this going to work? I think that's a really huge piece.
Right. I mean, I think you don't just finish the research, and because nobody does a lot of research and a lot of listening and come away without some opinion.
Right.
And so what happens is that if you go now to staff and say, okay, here's what we found in response to the question you asked, or in response to the question that somebody out in the community raised, here's what we found. What are you going to do with it? Do you feel, I mean, there are going to be 6 members of that board, a 7-member board, who all have different opinions about how this should be resolved. And when it's not resolved that way, what happens?
What I'm going to suggest as a possible, and it is how pretty much all of that has happened to date. So I can only tell you to date. Is that every decision and everything that has to be done is done through the lens of catalytic thinking.
Okay.
And that if catalytic thinking is guiding the decisions that are being made on the ground, we know that those decisions will, we have a higher likelihood that those decisions will meet with our values. Because the values are embedded into the thought process. But I like the thought of the board. I think it was Justin and Dimitri at a couple of meetings ago. The two of you brought up this whole concept that the board is democratized by doing this, that anybody can ask, do we have the answer to this? And they don't have to be experts in it. It's probably better that they're not experts in it, to be able to go back to others who are not experts in it and saying, oh yeah, I understand this piece. And here's how I found the answer. Does that meet what did we even get close? And to be able to then bring that back in and say, yeah, we didn't get close, but I'm handing it back to you. And again, using catalytic thinking to figure that out.
So I'm seeing that you're asking for a whole new brand of board member, and it's got to be somebody who completely immersed in catalytic thinking. Or prepared and trained in catalytic thinking.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that doesn't take that much.
No, it doesn't. It's
Here's the questions you'll ask.
Because you're blowing up, which I love, by the way.
Yeah.
You're blowing up the Lady Bountiful image of a board member.
So yeah, I want to jump in on that because I think I really get into this sort of, you know, again, the Justin mental gymnastics. So of thinking about capacity versus competency. So capacity is the fact that something is actually happening.
Right.
It's what needs to happen. Competency is actually the skill and the appropriateness of being able to do the thing, whatever it is. So when organizations are all volunteer and the board is the operational organization. The board really does have the competency. I mean, they are the organization, but soon as we professionalize, and I think what we're talking about here is sort of, it's the big swing of the pendulum. I mean, we are now totally disassociating the board from the actual competency of delivering the service. And so now, what does that mean? I think, Anne, to your question, is really my job now, the integrity is integrity to a system that ensures that there's a capacity for the fiduciary responsibility. And so, I mean, there's lots of things that are coming together, but I think about, you know, the curse of knowing. Like, we've stacked our boards with people who think they have the answer. And what we're learning is, you know, vast majority of the time, the data actually tells you that whatever someone's opinion was actually wrong. and so we have this opportunity to say the capacity that we need to ensure is that one that keeps asking, you know, one, what's the answer we're looking for? I mean, that's a big frame, and a lot of it is what's in the you know, what's the benefit that we are after. But then, you know, sort of really coming at it, sort of that board is really just the mechanism to say, who has competency in this area? Where, and what is their recommendation, or what is the collective competency that's out there? What does the data say? And so what happens is that the board is no longer the arbiter that we think of it as. They're not the ones who judge yes, no, maybe so. They're the ones who say, you know, who has the competency, and if has the decision-making authority been put to the test of that entity, whomever it is, whether it's community members, whether it's a data set, what, you know, whatever it is, that's there for that, for that ability. And I don't know, I'm curious what Angie thinks, because she's sort of, I think, at the crux of how research influences action.
Yeah, Carl, you wanted to say something. You want to jump in first and then I can jump. Are you okay?
Carl?
Go ahead.
Go on, Angie, you go first.
Well, I've been thinking about, to your point, Justin, this, like, we all have these implicit biases, right? That we have been trained, conditioned to, and so we know that oftentimes we are incorrect from, you know, in what we think of our opinions. Unbiased opinion is actually not unbiased, right? And so I guess connecting to this idea of what the board needs or has to be open to doing. It seems to me like there's an opportunity here, and related to what Carl was saying earlier, for us to be intentional about lifting the voices of, and listening and lifting the voices of others, especially maybe the people who have had the least power traditionally. And when you think about it in the organizational fiduciary sense, having the fiduciary role inherently means we have a certain amount of power that somehow has to be distributed or redistributed. That's as far as Carl, maybe you can pick up on that.
Well, I'm finding these quite challenging, these conversations. Not challenging as in I think you're wrong. Challenging in the sense that, you know, I mean, they strike at my heart of, you know, what's charity, what's it for, and whether charity is in fact a good thing in the sense that I understand it. So you were all, you know, in all the conversation so far, it's making me think of some of the people here in the UK who are the sort of the ABCD practitioners who, is it Jim McKnight over in the US, who was sort of saying, actually, you know, it all went wrong when professionals started getting involved, and real community development is about taking away the power of these people who sit on boards and sort of dispense their wisdom and so on. So And it made me think that this is a challenging discussion for us, because I think a lot of the discussion that we have about this is how. And actually, a lot of this discussion is pointing me towards who.
Mm-hmm.
And who, again, who for, as opposed to sort of who alongside. Are we allies, or are we sort of doers for, and so on? So possibly following your question, Angie, and sort of Justin's points, it's sort of question than just what's the role of the board.
Carl, could you
There has
could
to
you
be
repeat what that just you blipped? So if you could
Sorry.
you said to get to the point, and then
So there has to be a more nuanced question than just what is the role of the board. It's almost a more nuanced question that is, what are the roles on the board? Because for some, there will be those sorts of fiduciary sort of responsibilities and expertise that maybe those with lived experience will never have and don't have. But also that rather indicates that you need those people with lived experience, or what's the expression we use here? Expertise through experience. You need those sorts of roles on a board as well, so that it's, coming back to it's of and with, not just for. Sorry if that doesn't make sense.
no, it makes great sense.
No,
I also am thinking that you talked about it being about who versus how. I think it's also very much about to what end versus how. You know, what does that end goal look like for everyone, for different people, and it may look very, very different for different people.
I think there's an
Sorry, can
No,
I
go
just
ahead,
come in
Carl.
there?
Yeah.
And that's absolutely right. And to give you a sort of a live example here in the UK, we are about to leave the European Union. We will probably leave the European Union, and there are strong expert arguments that will literally make some people poorer. Okay, and the response of experts and professionals and so on is one of incredulity. That people will vote to make themselves poorer, because we look at it through our perspective that we are people who own wealth and assets, and we can't believe that someone might want to lose them. But for those people who don't have wealth and assets, the idea that you can be any poorer, I mean, it is a nonsense. And for them, there are deeper questions about dignity and the fact that they've been ignored, and we can't see that for them. So as uncomfortable as it is for us, because we haven't involved those people in these sorts of discussions, we can't see it.
I think, just as Angie was saying, and Carl, what you were saying, I mean, the heart of this is power, and just thinking about, you know, are we on the vanguard of, you know, constructing an organization with a different concept of power and where it comes from. I don't think it's a new idea. But, you know, just sort of being in that space. I do think, you know, going back actually, Hildy, to something that you said when you were sort of framing this, when, you know, I sort of tongue in cheek said, you know, what's the legal obligation of the board? And I said, nothing, you know, nothing concrete in any rate. I mean, as you read through stuff, it's duty of care, duty of loyalty, you know, it's, you know, behave in the best interest, if anything. I mean, and then they start to talk about these other roles, but it really strikes me that all of those roles and responsibilities are just choices we're making. I mean, we're hoisting, and I think Hildy, you were saying this, we hoist a lot of operational things onto the board. Like, you know, you know, writing you always use a human resource policy, legal stuff. Hildy is a great example, which is the vast majority of people on a board don't have the expertise to be approving a policy about human resources. They don't know the law. Yet we think it's perfectly okay if they're white and smart for them to be doing that. So there's this element that I think where we really do have to sort of separate, when is it that we're just asking individuals to do a task for us in support of the operations of the organization, in which case you want the best person. I don't want the board writing an HR policy, human resources policy. I want a human resource expert. Why would I want the board determining the efficacy of a program to help a community that I'm not a part of. I mean, it's the same, it's the exact same thing, yet we seem to be okay. And this is the us versus themism, I think, that Carl was talking about. We seem to be okay when we're making broad strategy decisions or resource decisions, thinking that we have the expertise for that. So I think there's something really important, and Anne, I think it was some of what I picked up on, sort of the curiosity you're asking, is the redefinition of the board is actually, we're not putting any roles and responsibilities onto the board. We're holding that whole notion of roles and responsibilities and being much more deliberate and intentional. Now, it might be that Carl sits on the board and he has a great insight into what it means to, be the CEO of a large, national organization, in which case we want that expertise, but that's not as a role, that's not as a board member, that's not as a board. That's just Carl and his expertise, and as a board, it's our job to make sure that the expertise comes in as best it can, that we're porous. And I think that's the part that really is rattling people, and it rattles people when I talk to people about it, which is to say, I'm not telling you it's wrong to ask board members to do stuff. I'm saying it's wrong to say that is a role and responsibility of board members as a general blanket. The sole purpose of the board is to be the fiduciary. It's the only legal obligation, or the integrity. That's all they actually have to do. So let's talk about that and make sure you're doing that well. And then as an organization, you just need to be very clear on all the other expectations you're putting onto people who serve on the board. And then you start to get into, I think, other, bigger justice and equity questions, as to say, are you building those roles and responsibilities lists in a way that reinforces, power dynamics, us versus them? I think some of what Carl was raising in terms of, the construct of what the purpose of the organization is. Like, sorry, I got a little messy there.
No, you now you got my head going a little more. As Chidi would say on The Good Place, my brain feels like I'm chewing on tinfoil.
I relate to Chidi. I love that character.
Don't we? The thing that's striking me, we have to date as a sector globally inherited a structure that came from wealthy people wanting to be benevolent to the rest of the world. And so they, of course, were going to have their peers, and the only ones they would trust are their peers. And, we sort of hand that down to, well, you have to have a lawyer, and you have to have an accountant, and you have to have a this, and you have to, and that whole sense of, and you have to give a lot. All of those constructs, which are absolutely, Justin, you nailed it, they're all made up. We just kept piling more crap on top of, well, that's the board's job, and that's the board's job, when in fact, that does not come from God. We invented that, and we just keep patchworking it. And so it makes perfect sense why there are no community people on boards. Why when I know that when I do speaking, and I just mentioned the fact that in the US, federally funded health centers need to have a majority of people receiving service sitting on the board. And I can't tell you the number of people go, oh, that's interesting. No, it's ridiculous that you don't. And it is absurd that you think lawyers and dentists and whoever else professionals who don't live in the community but work there. So just go down the list. So we've created this construct that guarantees that this isn't about normal people. And what I love the thought, I just keep hearing it over and over in my head, of the democratization of the board. That it isn't about who has power and who can give a lot of money and who has connections. That it's about who cares. Who cares about this? Yeah, it's striking me. Carl, and then Jane.
This is a fundamental challenge we face in the UK, what you just described, Hildy, where boards increasingly, there is a risk that they're going to be just dominated by professional people because of the responsibilities that we overlay on them. But then there's a paradox here, which is as you have more professional people on boards, you increase the expectations, and therefore when things go wrong, because they do,
Yes.
you somehow then say, oh, well, you're a professional, you should have known better, and therefore I'm going to charge you with sort of doing this wrong because you are a professional. And then you're going to start deterring professionals from sitting on boards because they don't want to then get into trouble in their day jobs. The community people can no longer do it because you've professionalized the whole shebang so much.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I just had to rant then.
No, that's a good one.
I have a few comments. One is that one of the governance experts in Canada at one point published an article called "From Blue Jeans to Business Suits," explaining how wonderful it was that boards are becoming professional, which I took him on with public comments about how that would make most of them worse. And it was the other direction that most of them needed to go. Couple of other things, and this is sort of devil's advocate. One is that our biggest agent organizations now in the sector in Canada are social service and health, and they're not formed anymore on a Lady Bountiful version. They're formed on the government doesn't want to do this, so we'll give grants to organizations to do it. We will contract it out to organizations, which could make a lot of what we're talking about much harder in those organizations to implement the good ideas that I'm hearing here, because the people signing those contracts and deciding which organizations to give the contracts to would be horrified by these discussions.
Well, it is no different. Okay, my head just went blah, blah, blah. The tinfoil. It's no different than a funder saying, and yes, I think any place that has government contracting is exactly the same, Jane, but it's no different than a funder looking at, well, we'd like to see your board list. Well, these people don't have the expertise to manage the $2 million we're going to give you. Who on your board is familiar with what it takes to manage $2 million? And you know, yeah, it's the same. We have a local organization here in Tucson that makes me crazy. That every year, well, for this thing, every year they do a huge gala. They raise a lot of money. This began decades ago as basically the wives of the wealthy. They give a lot of money for capital, and there's not a lot of money for capital improvements in places. They not only want their name on the building, but they want one of their people on your board.
Of course.
And why? Because the only thing we see fiduciary as is money. And so I want to make sure you're using our money wisely. Angie, then
well, I actually had a question that was for Angie, because I'm really curious about how you would apply this thinking to your current search for a new executive, or how Carl would have felt if he'd been hired by whoever happened to be in the room that day from the community, who he might never see again. So that's my devil's advocate part of how does it work on the stuff that's actually organization-wide. It's not a, you know, does this individual get that service kind of frontline decision.
Yeah, and I think, well, I think it comes down to what do we value, what kind of expertise we value. So there's certain kind of expertise that you just discussed, Hildy, that, you know, about managing $2 million versus the values that we've already articulated for ourselves, right? It's in the blog post that you sent out about our statement of values in action. If these are our values, and how, you know, there's a certain kind of expertise. It's a different way of thinking about expertise, but an expertise to be able to an expertise of what, you know, life is like on the ground, and expertise in connecting with other people, you know, that kind of thing. It's just a different, putting a different kind of aspect of what we value and how we understand what's important. So that's a kind of, I guess, thing we need to, it seems like that's the frame by which we think then about what board members need, or what kind of board members going forward.
I want to bring up the graphic that I created out of our conversation last time. And the paragraph before that, if we want to know what questions and expectations people have of us, the role of the board would be to ask them, to devise mechanisms for answering those questions, to share the answers, and to repeat that process over and over. And so asking what questions do people want answered, anyone who has expectations of us, design systems to answer those questions, find the answers, ask how people want to receive the answers, design systems to share those answers, and then ask again. And so in constructing, because what winds up happening, it's so easy for us to, there's two big questions that we're conflating. One is who makes decisions and how are they made? Who is included in making those decisions and how are they made? The second one being about the role of the board, who will make no decisions, but will be asking the questions, finding out who to ask those questions of. And basically, Justin, you used the word ensure before, and I think that is really the powerful word, that the board is the ones constantly making sure that anybody who has expectations of us has those expectations answered. So I just wanted to sort of insert that in when we're looking at and we're going to have immense discussion about how decisions are made and who gets to decide. What will it take to ensure that those decisions are shared to the best degree possible? As we're looking at this board question, I'm really looking at what does the board need to know? The whole piece about protocols is sort of standing out for me. Is knowing what questions, who to ask, how to. I mean, just like there's like logistical stuff.
I see a priority here, which I think is going back to the conversation around the arbitrary roles and responsibilities assignments. It's not arbitrary, but just that there's layers. I think we need to build the model that shows there is like concentric circles. Like there's a core competency that you have to have, which could be, you know, facility with catalytic thinking. And some of what you're talking about, I think, Hildy, with, you know, the notion of fiduciary, which has embedded in it understanding what the benefit is you're after and how to best ensure that there's a system that's producing that. Like that I think that's the first thing, is we have to give permission to say, that's the must-have. Anything else above that as a concentric circle is not a requirement of board service. It becomes an add-on. If you happen to be somebody, you know, so if we talk about the professionals, if you happen to be an attorney who can do something, great. If you happen to be someone who's a good fundraiser, great. But your responsibility as a board member is simply this core piece. Everything else is just an operational volunteer. Like, it really sort of gets my goat that we think about board service as this shit. Like, come be on our board so you can do all this work for us and get the prestige. And it's like, well, there's a lot of people who will just do the work for you. I mean, you invite them nicely, they will say, please let me contribute. I don't want to be on the board. And so I think that there's a mechanism by which we can really introduce a new model that says, as a board member, you need to understand this is it. This is all you are responsible for as a board member. When we convene as a board, these are the issues we talk about. Maybe it is that chart that you have there of, you know, because every organization is simply behaving on its design construct, all of its assumptions. So what we're really trying to do here is figure out, well, what's the assumption correct? Who made the assumption? Who's applying the assumption? Do we have a mechanism to ask whether the assumption was correct and correct the assumption and introduce a new assumption? Because it's just going to be a new assumption. But it is that process of just saying, you know, who it's understanding that role for boards, but it's, I think, also recognizing that organizations are simply a design construct that is purely a set of assumptions and values that have been organized and structured. And we might be, they might have been structured because of bias and system bias. They might be structured because we're a faith-based organization. They might be, but like those are the two things I think the board member needs to know their role, and then they need to know what that design construct is of the organization, so they know what they're shepherding. Because it's not about the stuff, it's about the assumptions.
Yeah. And I'm hearing an opportunity for also saying, we don't have the expertise on the board, so let's invite the expertise to this particular question.
I'm seeing that the expertise on the board is not content.
No,
That the expertise is in being able. There's going to be, because you can hear my brain is just gone. Because the norm is boards decide, they have expertise, they're professionals, then there's going to be a dance. Some people are going to want to step in to a different role because that's what they're used to. And the acknowledgement that you don't have to have, I mean, I loved that democratization conversation. I know I keep coming back to it because anybody can ask the kinds of questions that Justin just asked. Was our assumption correct? It's knowing who has the expertise within the realm of the network to answer that question. And so to me, there's identifying where, one of the things the board needs to know is, who are we asking out in the world if we're seeing the organization separate? If we're looking at you know, pardon the language for right now, because we don't have language for this. But who do we ask out there and who do we ask in here to answer what they want out there? So, and understanding what the board's role is in that. But I think that there's a big piece in who are we talking to to get the questions and to get the answers.
and who's doing the talking? I mean, because I spent so much time in the Central Valley of California, I know that I could go to whole towns and never get anyone to talk to me, even though I asked the right question. But if I go with my friend Rosala, she will get the answers.
Right.
So.
Right, yeah.
So Hildy, where is this taking us?
We're trying
in terms of our thinking about our own structure and where we're going to. Because as is always the case with these, I find these really stimulating and interesting questions, but I'm not always sure about where this takes us next. That's not a criticism.
Yeah, I think probably where we're exploring, and that's really what this is and is going to be, is exploring, is what do board members need if we're going to create this thing. One of the questions is what are the board members going to need to know in order to do this job? What are they going to need to understand? What is going to need to be clarified for them? What protocols might they need? What systems might they need? What support might they need in order to do this job?
I think that all sounds really good. And I would add, if I may, what experience do they need? Because I think for me, that's the key thing that comes out, is that some of the stuff that you need, it's not about learned knowledge, it's about experiential knowledge.
So let's play with that. What kinds of experience might someone need in order to be this board member that we're talking about?
Well, I think if you're talking about, are you talking about this our own board, or are you talking
about
boards?
About creating this thing for this board, creating that cycle for this board.
Okay, so for this board, if we are trying to build the capacity of small organizations in particular, I would suggest that we need people like Justin who have experience of running small boards and who know what the realities of dealing with their own board will look like, and whether or not some of the ideas and concepts that we play with are realistic.
Okay.
I don't think they need to be governance geeks.
Right.
I think they just need to have that sort of sense of, do they think that they could politically make what might be a very good idea to us sort of intellectually work?
And I just want to clarify that because our work is not just limited to nonprofit organizations, that it is, I think, even beyond that, the kind of experience, if you're active in your neighborhood association, if those kinds of experiences, that's sort of the lived experience of people who are taking our classes, who are yeah. What else? What other kinds of experience do you think that people would need to have?
I think it's useful to have experience functioning as a group. One of the issues I've seen on a lot of boards is you get small business people and whatever who have never had to ask anybody else before they make a decision. They haven't had to discuss their issue with anyone else. You just make the decision for yourself alone and move on. And that is a very difficult switch for them to have to talk things through as a group and not just impose the first thing that comes to mind. For them, everybody's supposed to say yes and do it.
Yeah, I was once on a board that was made up of executive directors and introducing them to catalytic thinking, and they couldn't handle it because they said, we just want to make a decision now.
Right, right. Right. Well, and what that's making me realize is that one of the qualities we're looking for, especially in the initial board, once we have systems up and running that people can fit into, they'll get a sense of it, but at least in the initial board, the word restraint keeps coming to my mind as we're talking. The ability to go, oh yeah, that's not ours to do. Because we're so used to all those layers and making the decisions and or being led to make decisions. There's a piece there about restraint.
I think there's also kind of a knowledge of what they're getting into, which touches on Jane's comment and Carl's, that a prospective board member needs to understand this is not what they think a board is. Or this may not be what their assumption of a role on the board is. And that they're open to that and that they're interested in that.
Yeah.
You could even try to make an argument that you're best off with people who've never been on a board and have no assumptions of what a board should be.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
I was looking for something. There's a writer, Maria Popova, who she had this great recommendation. She said, question your maps and models of the universe, both inner and outer, and continually test them against the raw input of reality. So to Carl's question about experience, We want people who have demonstrated their ability to challenge their own assumptions.
Mhm.
We
Beautiful.
need people who are comfortable doing that, as well as perhaps people who have demonstrated experiencing questioning assumptions and power.
Mhm.
Because we fundamentally really are, that's what we're asking people to do, to constantly reassess, you know, name the model, assess it. That's there.
And
There
sharing
is
power. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, after you, Angie.
Just sharing power and being willing to embrace the sort of values that we have articulated.
Mhm.
That's it, Carl. Now you.
I was going to say, I'm stating the bleeding obvious here, but I think what this conversation is highlighting to me is that diverse boards are stronger. What essentially we're talking about is a mix of sort of professional expertise, lived experience, diversity in terms of thought. So Justin's sort of challenges to the system, who want to sort of not make the existing system work, but to sort of build a new one. But then other people whose thought process is much more about incremental change and trying to change the systems that we've got. I think what it's highlighting for me is that so many ways that we think about so much of the time, the way that we think about boards is just in terms of professional expertise. But what this discussion is bringing forward is that there are a whole other range of ways of thinking about what a board member can contribute. And this is sort of flushing them out for me.
One of the things that's occurring to me as you all are talking, there is, so I'm thinking about someone who's never been on a board before, who thinks of themselves as, I'm just a fill in the blank. I'm just a neighbor. I'm just a community member. I'm just a, the power in their being able to say, okay, here's the question somebody had. We know who to go to. Let's make the assumption that they know who to go to for the answer, through whatever channels they know. And that answer comes back and they don't understand it. And there is, to me, huge power in one of the protocols on the board being, if you don't understand it, your job is to go back to the people who answered the question to say, make me understand this. Because until I understand it, nobody else is going to understand it. And again, that whole thing about being just a regular person, the opposite of the professional who says, oh yes, I understand all that jargon. No, I don't understand what you just came up with as an answer. And I have to understand it before I can say, yes, this memo that you just wrote can go out as the answer. But there's something really big there about, again, just regular people. Be almost translating a lot of the gobbledygook that comes out of organizations so that it is understood by our peeps.
You made an assumption in that about knowing where to go. So I'm following that line of, one of the things you would want on this board is people who have an extensive network of contacts. If I don't know where to go, I know someone else who might know where to go. That we're not just going to say, well, who in the world would know anything about whatever? Within the board, somebody would know somebody who would know somebody. That would
And the answers they would be getting would be coming from our network. So the expectations would come into the board, and there's a piece there about, and again, I mentioned, I really see that this board is going to need support. They're going to need, for lack of a better word, a staff. That staff may be the ones with deep knowledge of the organization. But the board sort of as the synthesizer of the question, of the recipient of the question, and the connector.
It's still best if you have a wider network
I
than
agree.
the organization.
I agree. Yeah.
I mean, that's why you're using examples from New Zealand and whatever, is because you've broadened your network
I agree.
beyond what most organizations have been able to do.
Hildy, that position that you just described pops up in current organizations as a board liaison staffer. Sometimes it's just a secretary who gets the minutes out or something like that. But sometimes it's really somebody who works very closely with development as well as executive staff. And this is particularly true in the larger organizations. And I think it would be, might be interesting to look at those positions because they need to be redesigned too.
Oh my gosh, yes.
You know,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think just to build on this idea of using our own networks, I think there's, I think that obviously that's an important aspect, but it also, our networks are limited. I think, at least I've been coming across this a lot in my role with Arnova of like thinking about, you know, who's going to be, who do we ask to serve on award committees and so on and so forth. And we tend to go just to the people we know, which are very similar to us. That's it, like human nature, I think. So part of this is thinking about, back to the point that Carl made about diversity, it's going to mean pushing outside of our kind of comfort zones and networks if we're going to be able to do that.
That whole recruitment process. Yeah. I mean, there's thinking about recruitment, thinking about bylaws. Obviously, our bylaws will need to change. What will this board, in order to be able to do its job, what would they need to have? We're sort of dancing around some sort of staff. You know, one of the things, Anne, that occurred to me is that we see it as unusual or wow, it would be really nice if our board had staff, unless it's a big organization. And then, as you noted, it is frequently related to development, to fund development. It is so interesting to me that that we've so turned the role of a board into a nothing that does not have any value, that why would somebody fund staff to support that board when they don't really do anything? And I mean, it's so interesting as I've been thinking about this board is probably going to need staff, and this staff is actually going to be productive for the mission in the world and not just about fundraising. But that it's almost anathema that boards have staff, because, well, what do they need staff for? On the other hand, I know a lot of organizations that are afraid that if they were to give the board staff, the board would take more power and would start wielding things and making decisions that yet so we almost want to disempower boards.
There's also the issue of why would the board need training? Because I'm sure all of you have seen budgets that provide more orientation and training money for the intern and summer student than they do for the whole board, because they haven't been valued enough to be given a training budget.
Yeah.
And this might as well, in some cases, yes, I've met executives who don't want their board trained. That would be scary if they had a trained board that knew how to ask better questions.
I'm struggling a little bit with the board requiring staffing, and it might just be how I'm constructing it, but the board certainly needs avenues to be able to inquire. Sort of, it's this inquire, trust, and verify. I mean, that's what we're asking them to do, because we've taken decision-making off the table.
Right.
Which in some ways means I no longer actually need to manage vast amounts of information. I mean, to the point, the construct of a board right now does require staff, because I'm prone to hyperbolic statements, but the way we have boards structured right now, the people making the decisions are actually liable for bad decisions, because there's just no way that they have the breadth of knowledge. So they're not really making the decision, they're just verifying the decision that's being made by the staff. There may be some other, there are some places where the expertise will come in, but so I guess part of what I'm trying to get my hand or head around is there does need to be the competency and capacity to do the inquiry, to elucidate what the strongest decision is. I mean, we talk about catalytic thinking as a decision-making tool, and the number of times where we've done it, and those of us who practice this that basically say, look, if you go through the process, the decision is made. No one's making the decision. You've just asked enough questions that have presented the path pretty clearly. Like, the discernment was actually in the inquiry. It wasn't in opinions. It was like when we reconcile all of that. So I think about that the organization needs to have this inquiry engine. And what the board needs to understand is just what, was the process engaged in? Was it, because in fact, there's a part, and I want to be really careful because you have legal obligations, but we don't actually want the board like second guessing and redeliberating a decision. What we want is the protocol is demonstrate to me the efficacy of the process so that I can trust that this is the best decision that's been determined by those who are involved. And there's probably going to be some gut check that says, hey, is that going to bankrupt us? I got to watch out for that. Was that considered? But I feel like it's like we have this ability to give board members the blessing of a beginner's mind. You don't need to be overburdened with all of the technical crap. What you do have to be versed in is an understanding of process and ability to determine the efficacy of a process. And so that's where I'm sort of struggling of, I'm not sure if we're talking about staffing the board, what that really means other than creating a conduit of transparency of how those things are happening. Particularly if we're a networked, movement-oriented organization where that's happening in a lot of different places.
I see the staff as more of a mechanical thing myself. Somebody has to say, here's the list of telephone numbers of the people you want to talk to. And I mean, you're asking a board not to do some very important things. The wonderful aspect of this is true engagement of the board in the organization. And I mean, I'm sorry to have used the word engagement in its original sense, but there it is. And that means that they automatically have a sense of caring. But I think the staffing, I'm looking at somebody just saying, we want this is the list of people who care, who are involved in this question, and this is their telephone numbers, and yes, I will be happy to make an appointment for you if you need me to. It's a mechanical thing more than that, and gathering then the information together in forms for people to look at it. So
I don't know whose role this is, but just facilitating this discussion is obviously a very complex, endeavor. We need, and even though, yes, I understand catalytic thinking, I'm still learning. I'm still, so the board will need help always probably in like facilitating that discussion, and that will perhaps be a staff role or a board member's designated role. I don't know, but that's going to have to be somebody who keeps us all kind of on task with the process.
Right.
And depending on what is determined, and I see this as morphing over time. I mean, the board is going to help create whatever this is. Depending on the degree of work that this requires of the board, of a volunteer board. It may require staff to do some of the work so that the board has what they need. And I, it could be initially forming the questions, but depending on the degree to which they are picking up the phone and calling people, the board could be delegating to somebody. Here's the question that came in, and we need to talk to 20 or 30 different people, and here's the team that will do that talking. And here's the questions that we want asked when you're asking those questions. But again, if this is a group of volunteers, to what degree, if 7 people have questions, if 10 organizations have questions, to what degree are those board members responsible for actually doing the work versus ensuring the work gets done?
I think that's contingent upon the size of the organization. I mean, in as much as I see things sort of going on here, when it's a small organization, we tend to call them a management committee, because the implication is that they are implicated in the day-to-day management of the organization. But when the organization gets bigger, we start calling them a trustee board. Horses for courses.
Well, and looking at the list that we had of all the people to whom might have expectations of us, that's a long list of people to ask. What expectations do you have of us, and what would you want to see in answer to, are we meeting those expectations? I mean, the easy ones are the IRS and the state government. Those are the easy ones. But talking to potential partners in our work, and institutional funders and donors and volunteers and other individuals investing their assets to help accomplish the mission, and people doing research and other board members. And I mean, asking those questions and getting those questions back is a job.
It's an operational job.
It is
not
an operational,
not a board job.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking.
I mean, I think that's there is nothing besides this facilitating the integrity. There is nothing else that the board does that is not actually organizational operations. I mean, setting strategy, doing finance. I mean, everything that is operational. And so if we are, again, sort of coming from a standpoint of saying the board is not operational. It is not, it's about integrity of the operational system, but it doesn't actually do operational things.
Right.
Now, again, I want to be very clear, because I don't want to say that we're basically isolating this operational capacity. We just have to be really, really clear in differentiating that, in saying, as the board doesn't do anything operational. It does this integrity oversight piece. Now, board members, because of their connection to an organization, may then also provide operational support. And there may be some expectation for board members that we need your additional capacity. We just need you to understand, for the board stuff, we need this. Then we're going to find other places where you can be of an operational volunteer support to us because of your expertise, because of the experience you bring in. We begin to get actually much better meshes, which is, I tell people, don't ever invite me on the board if you want me to fundraise, because I'm not very good at it. That's just a silly I mean, I thought there was a great board source statistic. I know it's a little tangential, but only 24% of boards are rated as successful on fundraising. If we think about return on investment that nonprofit organizations are making in terms of all the training, all the time and investment, everything that they're trying to do to get board members to fundraise effectively, they're not. Like if we said that about any other activity, we'd be like, well, that's a stupid use of resources. And again, I know that's a hot button issue, the fundraising thing, but that's the thing is and I was actually just in a meeting with someone who said, I'm a strategic thinker and I joined a board so I could help this community organization like facilitate their strategic thinking, and they won't engage me to do that. They will not have, they're asking me to do all these other things. And it was like, yeah, we invite people to the board, like promising that we're going to use your expertise, and then we sit them in front of finance numbers and fundraising training.
Which they don't understand and don't want to do.
It's like I mean, my analogy now is it's like, drafting, your first draft choice for your baseball team is your first baseman, and you say, welcome to the team. Can you manage our concessions and ticket sales? Like, so sorry, I know, but again, I guess the summary point going back is just, we don't want to fall in the trap of reintegrating operations in this integrity role. I don't want to call it a governance role because that's so laden, but the integrity role is very finite. The operational support is something different, absolutely welcome, potentially needed. We just don't call it a role of the board or supportive board.
One of the things that I think about.
I'm going to mute so that you can put yours on, okay?
So you don't have to yell.
One of the things that I think about in terms of where the discussion is right now, which I think is wonderful, is that there needs to be sort of a constant renewal of the board's thinking. The board needs to be mindful, not assumptive. And I think because what we're proposing here is very, very different than any other board that you hear about. I'm almost wondering if there almost needs to be like the board teacher, that it teaches process to the board, not what to do, but kind of renew their thinking, help them practice asking the question, help the board be present with what their role is in this context, because it'll be very, very easy to have role creep and have, the board say, well, that copier you guys bought, my friend got one that was half that price. And so how do you do that in a way that is respectful and productive? Justin, your comment is so true. I mean, do we want the board members to be doing things that's not their highest and best use for this organization and for the mission of creating the future? So I'm wondering, Hildy, when you talked about a staff person or staff, whatever that means, if maybe that some of that's involved kind of an ongoing education of the board, so that the regular refreshers in terms of thinking this way, or pop discussions. I don't know what this can be, but I'm just thinking of it from that perspective.
And Angie mentioned before, having a facilitator, having someone who is skilled at catalytic thinking and who is facilitating bringing the having the training, having all of those things. The thought that is also I'm sort of playing with mechanisms. I mean, I think that one of the things the board is going to need in order to do this job is protocols and mechanisms. So if they want to know what the expectations are from X group of people, what is the mechanism for them asking that group of people what the expectations are? And then once those questions come in, what is the role of the board when it comes to that question or that set of questions? Part of me is thinking that part of that might be playing with the question. Are there other questions that raises? What does that question make possible, and for whom? Are there others we can ask before we get that question answered, so that we're making sure that the questions are answering all of the people that might have that question. Who is the best person within the organization to answer that question? Who or where is the group of people to whom we would go to answer that question? And when we get the answer back, does it fit with, do we think as a board that it actually answered the question, or do we, with our beginner's mind, even understand what the answer was? But at every point, I think that there's going to need to be, what is the mechanism for finding out, for connecting with people, for asking, for answering, for evaluating? Does this really answer the question? And I'm seeing that sort of wrangling being the kinds of things that the board would be doing. But the actual mechanisms of where does the question come from, where does the question go to, where does the answer come from, where does there's some mechanical stuff there.
Hildy, can you give me an example of a question that you think might be important for the Creating the Future board to be looking into for creating the future?
One of the questions we get asked all the time is, how do you know if you're successful? How are you measuring success?
And how do you see the board researching that?
That's what I'm saying. We need mechanisms for it. It's exactly what you nailed it. You nailed it. You nailed it. You know, is when that question comes in, who do we ask? What are our metrics? What are we using as a checklist? Earlier, I think Justin may have, and I'm not sure who at this point, because mentioned, is just the basic question of, is catalytic thinking being applied throughout the organization? Do we know that? Are decisions rooted in catalytic thinking? Is that actually happening? You said that was going to happen. Is that actually happening? And I mean, you nailed it, Anne. And okay, so who do we ask? What do we answer? Who's figuring that out? Is this prompting discussion? Is this something that we've never had this conversation? Oh, okay. So what does the board do then? Who do they go to? Where do are they convening people to have that conversation to get to the answer? Those are the real logistical things that sort of swim through my head when we think about this. And we're building something new, which is awesome. And we're gonna have to build every last bit of it.
Well, and there's also the issue of, if this is an organization that is supporting hubs that could be anywhere in the world, how does the board know what that hub is doing? And is it the board's responsibility to even know that?
I would answer that question, Dimitri, by saying that that's probably part of the thing, the whole issue of the board holding the space for the organization's integrity. So, yeah, the question has to be looked into.
That's really interesting. It does, though, rather beg the question of what it is that you're building. Are you building an organization, or are you building a social movement? And I guess the reason that I ask that is that there is an awful lot of interest in the UK at the moment about this emerging social movement called Extinction Rebellion, that is causing all sorts of problems sort of for some people in the UK, because they're doing civil disobedience type things. And they did something the other day. They a bunch of people in the movement climbed on top of a tube train, if you know the London Underground, and this is in a poor part of East London, and they stopped an awful lot of people going to work that morning. And one can argue, but I mean, it was probably a tactical mistake. I mean, if you're going to stop people getting to work, go to the rich part of London with all the car drivers that are causing the most pollution and so on. But for me, interestingly, that's led to huge numbers of debates about, well, actually, should the governance in the centre be in control of everything? Or is it the nature of these sorts of things that we're building that you just have to lose control and you have to be comfortable with losing control? But then does that beg the question of, okay, well, control centre that you do want tight control over, values, for example, which we've been talking about today, and you're prepared to lose control of operations, or is it something different? So it comes back to, what is it that we're building?
So I would go, I think, Carl, to your point, which is the board is a manifestation and necessity of an actual organizational entity, which means we are working with a set of assets. And again, I go back to the fiduciary. We're working with assets that are not ours. That we are caretakers, trustees of somebody else's resources. And so I think going back to sort of Anne's question that you had earlier of, the board's fundamental role then is, if the board only exists because an organization has been constructed and it's an organization that is making decisions about how to use, I'm going to use shorthand, public resources, public assets, then we do need some control mechanisms. Then we do need to start applying this fiduciary responsibility around integrity, which is asking the question, are the assets being used effectively and efficiently to advance our benefit? Like that's because now we've created the organization that's using those assets. If it's just sort of a movement where there really isn't a flow of support resources going and there isn't an organizational structure, then I think we're talking about something else that's there. So I do think that that's an important component to put into this, is the board needs to know what the assets are that are at play. If we go back to your original question, Hildy, we need to know what the assets are, where they come from, and where they're being distributed, because we do have an obligation as the board to make a value judgment about whether that is effectively and efficiently advancing the goal. That's the integrity piece that's there. There are a couple of things, like there is this tension that I think I'm feeling, because there's a part of me that's saying we need to make board service so accessible that it's actually not difficult. It's not a barrier. It's like we don't want people, I mean, going back to that democratization, we don't want to put barriers up that someone says, well, I don't have that, I can't be a part of that. Whether it's a network, whether it's resources, like I think a lot of what we're saying is no, we want to make sure that we're not doing that. And at the same time, we don't want to say this is a nothing job.
Like I don't think those do. Yeah,
I know, but I think it's there's a natural tension in our society, or aversion, which is to say, well, if you don't have to have the expertise, then it must not be that important. And what we're saying is, this is actually an important job in and of itself. It will be challenging, but we're not going to demand of you extraneous things for you to be able to do it.
I think it's different expertise. I think it's just, we're looking for some, and codifying the expertise that is needed, the qualities and characteristics of the human beings that will be in the role, rather than when we list it as qualifications and expertise, I think is when we go down that professionalized rabbit hole, and to think about it as the qualities and characteristics of a person might be a way of looking at that differently, that that takes away from the honoring of somebody's position rather than the honoring of who they are as a human. Jane, you had something, I'm sorry.
I'm going back to Justin's point about what we need to know about what might be happening out in a hub or another community group if we want to make sure that we are protecting the integrity and know whether they're living up to their values. I think that raises the question of, are those hubs part of us or are they partners? Because if they're partners, we don't have the same obligation that they have the identical values as us. So I think we have to then say, what is our connection to the hubs that we hope will form? Maybe they're a movement, maybe we don't control them. Maybe it's enough to preserve the integrity of this hub, whether or not that is a central hub, and let others live their own values.
I think it's yes, and I think there's going to be, and I'm being mindful of time, we're 5 minutes out. I think, and this is just me and my crystal ball, so take it for however many grains of salt you got, that we're going to have some hubs that are going to be very, very closely related and getting resources from Creating the Future and resourcing. So I'm thinking about some of our education programs. And there's going to be, a group in Saskatchewan that's got some stuff that they're pulling together, and they're using catalytic thinking, and they just want to be able to be part of the network so that there's communication. And I think you're right, Jane, but I think it's probably going to be both.
Yeah, I would expect so as well. And
yeah.
That's something we have to think about.
Very much so. Yeah. It is 5 minutes to the hour. This has been a brain teasing, brain stretching couple of hours. I'm going to encourage all of us to take a deep breath, like a real one, in and out. Look through any notes that you took during our conversation, circle anything that particularly stood out for you. And let's spend a moment in reflection. What is standing out to each of us? What are you going to keep noodling on as you go through the coming days and weeks?
Well, I'm not muted, so I guess I'll start in that I still have to think about, what do I need to know that integrity is being upheld? And I don't think I have the answers for that yet.
Yep.
But I do, you're right, it's a brain stretching thing. You even got all of us silenced at one point.
I think I take away that difference and diversity are incredibly valuable, and that the dimensions upon which we think about difference and diversity are multifaceted. It's not just difference in terms of professional expertise, but we have to think about these other dimensions like experience and I guess sort of attitude and approach to sort of life. Maybe that's political sort of beliefs and so on. And I will keep coming back to sort of this thing that's run through all of the conversation today, that's about power and privilege. We're incredibly fortunate, the people who were able to take part in these conversations, the fact that we can spend 2 hours talking about these things. And I think we always have to check ourselves that the things that we talk about and the approaches that seem important to us would seem important also to those people who are most marginalized, who we ultimately, I think, are sort of trying to help, because this is a social justice organization ultimately. And when we are thinking about sort of difference, I think sort of those who are furthest away from power, who as Jane so articulately sort of gets across, you know what I mean, they need to know that we're being held to account. Where do they figure in this?
Well, I think I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about the phrases that we need people with experience in challenging their own assumptions and the ability to lead other people to challenge their own assumptions. So that's pretty huge, actually.
I just to sort of jump off of that, and that and this the power notion. I mean, what we are talking about is a fundamental shift in the power structure of how most organizations are built. And I know for myself, you know, it's heresy when I say, you know, the board shouldn't be doing this operational stuff, you know, because everybody looks at me and they're like, well, where are we going to get that? And that, so I think we are fundamentally asking people to re-envision what an organization looks like. And that, I think, to Carl's point about power, we have to redefine it from a mechanism that allows the beneficiary of, you know, whenever an organization is targeting a beneficiary, that voice shapes this. And when you were saying that, Carl, it made me think the things, so I'm gonna not check my language. The things we ask boards to do is bullshit in the grander scheme of what the organization needs to accomplish in the community. And our organizations, as great as they are, we are not hitting our highest potential of helping communities thrive. And so I don't care about fundraising. I don't care about legal stuff. I care about getting someone from the community on your board who can say, this shit works or this shit doesn't work for my community.
Carl?
That's the number one priority.
At the risk of hogging the airtime, there was a fantastic politician called Tony Benn in this country, very socialist, you know, a bit like Bernie Sanders. And he has 5 questions to ask of those in power. Number 1.
Oh, come on.
Number 3.
Carl, Carl, we missed, you blipped. So we missed numbers 1 and 2. So start again.
Let me start again. Number 1, what power have you got? Number 2, who gave it to you? Number 3, in whose interests do you exercise it? Number 4, to whom are you accountable? And number 5, and how can we get rid of you? So Jen's point is ringing in my head, and Tony Benn's questions, I think, answer sort of the way that Jane exercises her main question.
Wow. Carl, if you can send those, I will include those. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's no way to top that. So, but I think on the one hand, you captured so well, like on the one hand, we're trying to figure out what, for example, integrity looks like, but actually we can't answer that, or I can't on my own answer that. It's got to be us together answer it. And more, my job ultimately as a board member is to try to get, should be to get more people involved, who, especially the people that we don't hear from because of various privileges and structural issues and so on that are in place.
Yeah. Okay.
what I'm really reflecting on now relates to what Carl was just talking about. And I'm thinking that we're talking about the interface between privilege, power, difference, and diversity. What is that line in there? And how are we crossing it? Or how are we integrating it? Or how are we doing whatever? So that's kind of what I'm left with, is that division point of, or that interface, not division point, but that interface between all of that. Because generally those are on two different sides and don't really mix unless it's a confrontational mix. They don't blend, I guess is a better way of saying it. So that's what I'm leaving with in thinking about this.
I'm taking a couple things out of our time together. The first is, I think I need a drink. This is the big stuff. This is the wrangling of we have been playing in the theoretical realm for a while, and this is the what does it look like when the rubber hits the road, and we're inventing something, which is awesome. And there are others who are walking this path as well. And there's some really wonderful work being done by the Ontario Nonprofit Network in terms of reinventing governance, and they're asking similar questions. So it's fun that there's others to play with. I know that long ago, Judy Freyworth came up with a group out of the Alliance for Nonprofit Management, came up with a form of community engagement governance. And so we're walking a path with others alongside of us, and there's lots to share with each other, which is exciting for me. To me, it is a matter of blowing it up and starting over again, because it's not an incremental patch. It's not a, if we just tweak this or we just tweak that. Justin, I'm so resonating with the fact that our organizations have not reached their potential by any means. And structurally, they're not designed to. And the question that always is driving me is, what structures, what protocols will lead to our accomplishing missions? What structures and protocols will lead to communities actually improving? And to me, that's the only question that matters. And so I'm really excited about what we're wrangling with, because we're building something that I hope is, as you all noted, a fundamental shift. I hope so, because we need a fundamental shift. I mean, that's the bottom line in my mind, is we need it. And I could not be more grateful for all of you and each of you, and your fabulous brains and your willingness to put them out into the world, and where we're all going, I don't know. And we'll resume this conversation December 9th, same bat time, same bat channel. And if you all will share your thinking, if stuff pops for you, like when you're in the shower, when you're driving to work, or the two places we tend to do all our thinking, send stuff along, and we'll just keep adding it into the mix, because this is big and hairy and very fun. And just thank you all.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you
Thanks,
next
everyone.
month.
See you next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.